Okay, so now we're going to talk about the home front. What was going on in America during World War II? And simply put, the war ends the Depression with all the demand for war materials, war machines like planes, tanks, weapons, ammunition, explosive, shells. All these things were required to be purchased by the government to go use in war. And so all these industries just popped up out of nowhere, made towns that were desolate suddenly huge, bustling cities that because of all the jobs that these factories were suddenly producing. So that ends the depression. But there's a problem. When you go to war, most of the men are off fighting, and you don't have men working in these factories. And so they turn to women. This is something you see over and over again during war. We saw it with the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and so on, that women have to pick up the slack where men used to uh, function. And this is heavy industry. We're not talking about working in a farm or running a grocery business. We're talking about building tanks, airplanes, complicated machines. And for some of these, actually, these were well suited for women that had to pay attention to detail, had to have smaller hands to reach into these machines to be able to put them together. And I guess also add to that that they knew that these machines were keeping their men alive overseas, and that is a great motivating factor to make sure that you do a good job. So things like this picture right here, Rosie the Riveter. Um, I know we like to interpret like, yes, women, we can do it. We're we're great and so forth. But I really these photos here were to, or these pictures were to encourage women to get out of their comfort zone and do their part to help the war effort. Everything was about the war effort. We needed these women to come. If they didn't come and work in the factories, then those armaments don't get made and people die overseas. Our American boys don't have a chance without the amount of material that these women are able to produce. And so famous pictures like this were made. Soldiers without guns, that these are all things that were meant to be patriotic so that women would not only feel good about coming out and working, but also feel like they needed to. This was helping their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their uncles, um, and and it worked because a lot of women came out to work, made a lot of money in the meantime, but also did a great job in keeping our boys fully armed overseas. We out manufactured everybody, and it was a major factor in why we will win this war. Okay, but not everything was about the factory. We have only a certain amount of raw materials, and and so people were encouraged to save every scrap. Uh, Make sure that you don't throw away any food. Make sure you conserve everything. Just use what you need, and don't let anything go to waste. You have a newspaper, well, recycle that newspaper. You have any metal you're not using anymore, recycle that metal. You use tires, you use rubber on the tires, recycle that. We need to make sure that whatever you're not using at home, we recycle it and give it to the soldiers that are overseas so that they can use it and they don't run out of things. They don't run out of tires. They don't run out of um, material. This metal is very important to put together. I'm not an expert at recycling, but anything that would help with the war effort, that's what people were encouraged to do. Uh, One thing about these, not only was it very important for women with these factories being made, but also it was very important for the African American community. Uh, if you need people to build things, you're not going to be too picky. And so, especially in the South, I mean, there were some factories way deep in the South where there was a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination, but they had to tolerate it somehow. and work through it. There was a lot of strife. People were trying to treat African Americans very poorly. They didn't like it. They said, "Hey, we are doing our part for this country. We're doing our patriotic duty." And so they would lead massive marches to make sure that people stop treating them unfairly and try to discriminate, try to dock their pay or not pay them as much, or not let them go to restaurants or live in certain places, just make their lives miserable. And so this was a way not only to fight for your for better treatment, but also to prove to people that may have just fallen into sort of soft racism that you're just as good a worker, you're just as a patriotic American as anybody else, and you're doing your bit just like anybody else, and that there's no reason to go after somebody when you have a joint cause in this patriotic war that we were going through. And so you would have black Marines storming the beaches in the Pacific, African American pilots. You ever know about the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen? It's a great story. Definitely look it up. Black nurses tended to wounded of all colors. It didn't matter. I mean, you're in a fight. At that point, you can't be. If you're discriminating against people, you're just hurting yourself. And so this became very, very apparent, and a lot of good came, a lot of growing pains for America uh, occurred because of the war effort here. Another thing that was a real problem, and this is a big blot on Franklin Roosevelt. The American government went, and because of what happened in Pearl Harbor, we persecuted and put Japanese Americans, these are citizens, not just Japanese that came here, into internment camps, which were basically concentration camps. No, we didn't gas them, like as we'll see in our next lesson that we'll be talking about the Holocaust. However, we took these Japanese Americans, American citizens, took their businesses away, their homes, and shipped them off to camps in the middle of nowhere. As you can see here, they look like single wide houses, and they weren't even constructed very well. They're in the mountains. They can't really fend for themselves, and they had guard towers, barbed wire all around. They were treated like criminals, like traitors, and there was no evidence that this was going on, and it was a complete overreaction. Now, the U.S. government did go after Germans and Italians, but these were not citizens. And that's the difference between the Japanese and everybody else. And in 1988, the U.S. government finally apologized for what it did to the Japanese community and repaid their families for some of their financial losses. Um, this is different than, I think, other areas of where people think that the government should pay people for financial losses. This was a direct action by the government to a specific community because they belonged to a community, because they were Japanese by origin, and there was no evidence that these people did anything wrong. So that brings us to our vocabulary word: internment, the confinement of a large group of people who are held without having a trial.